I want to start with the first panel. Let's get straight into this, and I hope that those of you who are the early birds here are ready for a really interesting discussion. And our first panel is going to really set the big picture. We're going to look at the sort of national and international governance agenda. We're going to look at what is happening at the national level, indeed at the international level, to minimize anthropogenic impact on the ocean's securities. There are lots of initiatives, national and international. There are targets, there are initiatives, you know them all better than I do. Commitments to improving ocean health are being made at the highest level. But how well are they doing, and how are they translating into action? How are heads of state, ministers, policymakers working, I guess, to genuinely become leaders on the ocean? Not just to say the words blue economy, but to genuinely become leaders. To have that conversation, I am joined by two panelists here in person. Angela Ellard, who is Deputy Director of the WTO. Angela, why don't you come up and join me? Welcome. Thank you so much for coming. And Mary Goujon, Cabinet Secretary for the Rural Economy and Islands in Scotland. Mary, thank you for joining us. Why don't you come on up too? And I hope, joining remotely, Olivier Poivre-Davour, who is Ambassador for the Poles and Oceans in France. Olivier, I hope you can hear us. I can't.
Excellent.
Wonderful. I can't see you yet, but I hope that will be changed. But there you are. Very, very nice to see you. Thank you so much for joining us. So I'm now going to move over here. Welcome. Very, very nice to see both of you. Let us start very big picture. This is a big, big week. There seems to be pivotal events taking place in all manner of places, but particularly New York, the UN negotiations on the Treaty to Protect the High Seas. You obviously had, success last year with at the WTO. I want to know, when you put all of these things together, and I guess I've chaired this now eight times. Each year, I'm always wondering whether the glass is more half full than half empty. There is so much to do with the oceans, but we are gradually making progress. So I want to start asking all three of you, essentially, a very simple journalistic question, which is, are you optimistic or pessimistic about where we are? And let's start with you, Angela. I mean, the multilateral system, multilateralism isn't in a very good place in many areas right now. But is this an exception, the oceans? Are we making real progress?
Well, I would say I'm optimistic, but we have a tremendous amount of work still ahead of us. And the reason why I'm optimistic is because in the World Trade Organization last year, we did reach an agreement on fisheries subsidies, and I know we'll talk more about that later. But I think it shows that multilateralism is alive and well, particularly for issues like the ocean. It's an issue of the global commons. It's the only way we can deal with it is multilaterally. And I think there is now an increasing pressure to try to resolve these issues in a way that is sustainable, that is meaningful. And multilateralism is really the only way to address this. Our negotiations on fish subsidies began more than 20 years ago. It took us 20 years to reach an agreement. But finally, I think the pressure was building because we saw ocean stocks, fish stocks, declining to about 50% being overfished. And I think that created some pressure together with the SDG goals. And I think that gives me reason for optimism.
So we're going to drill down into how we implement and indeed improve on the agreement that you made a little later. But it is an impressive step forward that was at last was reached. Mary, what about from your perspective? Again, there was some progress made at COP26. Scotland's been doing very good things, but are you more skeptical of how much progress has been made, or do you think you're also upbeat? I know you're not going to sit on stage here and say you're depressed, so but let's be a little honest.
No, I'm definitely optimistic, because I think if I was pessimistic about the future, to be honest, I wouldn't be doing this job. And I think the whole purpose of doing it is you want to ensure that you're leaving your country, the climate, in a better place than when you started. I think there are huge Reasons for optimism. I think the agreement that Angela talked about is a perfect example of that, that in spite of all the challenges that are happening around the globe at the moment, an agreement like that was still able to be reached, because these are problems that we need to tackle by working together, and to do that on a global scale. I mean, in Scotland, for me, it's about how we put all these high-level agreements into action, and how we actually take those steps forward and implement it. And I think that, we haven't got all the answers. Again, that's why I'm here. I'm looking forward to hearing the discussions over the course of the next few days. But I think we've definitely made huge improvements in terms of the work that we're doing on our oceans, and are taking huge steps forward in terms of looking at our blue economy. We've set out a vision for that as a whole, the work that we're taking forward in blue carbon as well. And COP26 was huge for us. We obviously hosted that in Glasgow, and that was a real opportunity where we were able to put that focus on our oceans. As a result of the discussions at COP26, we started that annual dialogue on ocean climate-related actions. We had a 2-day blue carbon conference as part of that as well, and we really used that opportunity to integrate and strengthen the ocean-based climate actions that we can take, and really embedding that in the UNFCCC architecture as well.
Well, we will drill down into what you achieved in all of those again a little later. But Olivier, first of all, actually, first of all, to you, wonderful backdrop. It's an very, very apt backdrop for this good discussion. I'm sorry you couldn't be here in person, but we can see you very well. You are ambassador for the poles and oceans. When you discuss with your fellow policymakers, do you have the sense that they recognize now the importance that the ocean plays in the health and stability of Earth systems? Do you think that that penny has dropped of the importance of the oceans?
Being also the special envoy of the French president for the ocean, so I meet, and I've met last year tens or a great number of leaders, and they all care about the ocean, so they are excellent in the blue. And I will say it's not enough. It's not because you say you care about the ocean that the ocean will be in a better condition. And so we have to say it's not a matter to be optimistic or skeptical. 2022 was a good year. We started with the One Nation Summit in Brest. There were commitments from, let's say, something like 30 leaders. Then we had the Lisbon UN conference, which was the occasion for the maritime community to meet after the 2 years of COVID. There were some good news from the WTO about the illegal subsidies as well. Just after the One Nation Summit, the perspective in Nairobi of a plastic treaty against the plastic for use unique, which normally should be signed before the end of 2024. There was some good news as well, I should say, in Sharm el-Sheikh at the COP28, and the end of the year was perfect. The COP15 was a great surprise for everybody, because it started in Kunming, and due to the COVID, they have to move to Montreal, and Montreal was a huge success. We had this agreement on 30 by 30 by the end of 2030, which was extraordinary. I will not say that it's so optimistic. I'm not so optimistic for 2023. I was just coming back from New York. We're at the middle of the high seas negotiations, the BBNG. We are on Tuesday now. We are supposed to, we have 2 weeks. It's going to end on Friday, and we are quite far from an agreement. We have been working for more than 15 years on this high seas treaty. And so we will see. At the end of the week, I will be happy or not. If not, we will have to imagine other rendezvous next year, and probably also what will be crucial is the next UN conference in 2025, because you will have all around the table all the leaders caring only about ocean, because ocean is not a side event of a COP on biodiversity or a side event of a COP on climate. It's a main course for us, so we will have to put the pressure on the leaders it's what I do with my boss, President Macron, is very committed, but every ambassador has to do that, and especially the people and the citizens as well. They have to press their leaders to take decision and stopping this blue. Everybody thinks ocean is important. Now we have to prove it.
Thank you. Maybe we could stick with you, Olivier, and you could give us a bit of a more detailed situation report from New York. I'm a little alarmed to hear that it doesn't sound as though you're convinced there will be an agreement by Friday. Tell us what your senses of the sticking points are and what you expect by the end of the week. I mean, if you were just part of those discussions, give us a flavor of how they're going.
In fact, there are three solutions. At the end of the week, by the end of the week, there is a consensus, which I hope. If not a consensus, there will be a vote, which is extremely dangerous. You never know who is going to vote for, yes or no. And the third solution is to say, we have to meet again, a sixth session, and that would be a real disaster. So let's try to be optimistic. Let's try to have a consensus. The main debates are probably between, let's say, some countries, rich countries, and the other one, the G77. But multilateralism is not easy now. How to work with Russia, how to work with China in this world. And we will see. There is an issue which is important, the sharing of the benefits of the genetic resources and mineral resource, which is very important for some countries, especially the poorest of them. And so we will see, but there is only 4 days left, and we will know exactly. Friday, 11 o'clock, that would be too late to have an agreement if there is no vote, no consensus. But cross the fingers.
Friday, 11 o'clock. Just one more question, because this, I think, is a really interesting backdrop for all of you, which is the more difficult geopolitical situation right now making it harder to reach agreement? I mean, you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia. Clearly, there are many other multilateral fora that are basically not working, not functioning in the current geopolitical environment. Is that going to be the kind of problem?
It's totally impossible to speak with Russia on these kind of issues. It's difficult to speak with China, and we don't share with some countries like India or some countries from the G77 or from the G20. We don't have the same view on the war in Ukraine. And, for us, it's really a war made by Russia, and but for a lot of countries, I've been traveling a lot in Africa, in Middle East. That's not so clear. So the world is, is not so unanimous on that. It will not affect directly the maritime issues or this kind of ocean discussion. But at the end, if there is a lack of, if there is one vote which is not there from Russia, which is a great country, about ocean or China, so it will be not signed. So no, definitely ocean is an issue which is important for everybody for some good reason, environment, other reason, economy, and I'm sure, I'm confident on the outcome of BBNG in New York. So we will see.
Thank you. Well, that was a somewhat sobering note to move on to. But let's go from a challenged international agreement to one where you did make progress last year, really concrete progress, Angela. And why don't you both tell us about that for those people who didn't follow the details, but also tell us about the unfinished business, because there is quite a lot of unfinished business Absolutely. From the agreement on subsidies.
There is unfinished business. But at the same time, it was a remarkable accomplishment. So back in June, we held a ministerial conference called MC12 in Geneva at the WTO. And our 164 members at the ministerial level agreed by consensus, which means everyone has to agree. There's no voting in the WTO. 164 members agreed to ban certain prohibited subsidies with respect to fishing. So IUU fishing, as well as fishing of overfished stocks and subsidies related to fishing in the high seas. There are 22 billion US dollars spent per year on harmful, unsustainable fishing subsidies. And so this agreement is aimed at eliminating this. So the agreement now exists. We're in a very critical part right now because the agreement doesn't take effect until 2/3 of our members formally deposit instruments of acceptance. So far we have 2. This is, it takes several months to get this underway. So we've had 2 who just accepted within the last month or so, and we're expecting now a very steady stream of acceptances. So my plea to all of you out there in the audience and all of you listening is to get your governments to do everything possible to speed this process so that we can hit that 2/3 mark and it can go into effect. Then once it goes into effect, on day 1, everyone is supposed to be in compliance with their obligations. That's developed countries, it's developing countries as well, and the least developed. So we have a fund that we've established through the agreement that will help developing and least developed members undertake their obligations. So that's very important. We're looking for members of the WTO to donate to this fund. We have many pledges and contributions are starting to roll in. Then the next thing that we're working on is a second wave of negotiations because we hit the basics, maybe a little bit more than the basics, but we still have a long way to go. We also have to address subsidies that contribute to overfishing and overcapacity. And we also have to do this in a way that takes into account the special needs of developing countries. So there has to be some kind of special and differential treatment, and that has to be negotiated. So this wave of negotiations has already begun. In fact, we had a meeting on this, a plenary session at the WTO on Monday. We are starting a series of very intense negotiations, week-long negotiations over the course of this year. And we're hoping to reach an agreement by the time of our next ministerial conference in February.
So in the grand timescale of it, this was negotiated, what, for 20 years? And not, I'm going to exaggerate slightly, but not very much happened, and then suddenly quite a lot happened.
Yes.
When can we expect this agreement to be implemented, actionable, really affecting things on the ground?
Well, it's a good question, and it depends on our members. So once we hit that magic 2/3, then the agreement is in force, and it's a binding agreement. So in other words, if you don't comply with the terms of the agreement, you can be brought to dispute settlement. Obviously, we don't want that to happen. We want to see compliance. But the fact that there is binding dispute settlement backstopping this agreement should help. That plus our fund, which is helping developing countries. But what we're hoping to see and what we're starting to see is that members, even before the agreement enters into force, are already taking the steps that they need to be in compliance. So that is a very important development for us. And I think it also sends a signal that multilateralism is alive and well and that it is possible to achieve agreements. And to do so in the midst of a pandemic, because there is a pandemic still going on, I think that makes it very difficult for some. Also in the midst of a war, in the midst of a food crisis, yet it was possible to bring everyone together, maybe even because of these crises. It creates some impetus for multilateralism.
So we have that is actually both true and a good rejoinder to the the challenges that we're seeing in New York. So there are problems in some places, but in other places you've made progress. Mary, when you see this as someone who has to work with national governments, but actually really wants to get things done, how do you translate that into, you know, your ability to make progress? Because in the end, some national governments are also going to have to be really, really involved to making this stuff implementable.
And ultimately, we're the ones that have to deliver on these agreements. And I think the point that Angela made about not waiting to take that action until it's actually enforced and making sure we're taking those concrete steps is really key. And from a Scottish perspective, you know, we are a maritime nation. We are a strong fisheries heritage there too. We want to be world leading when it comes to our approach. And when it comes to looking at subsidies and what we provide funding for in Scotland, we don't subsidise that activity already. But we have got to make sure that we're taking these steps and ultimately trying to lead by example.
Can you tell us a bit about your shared stewardship approach? Because that's a very concrete way in which you have you know, worked to make progress at your level, even as the rest of these very big picture agreements are still being ongoing.
I think that that approach is absolutely critical to ensuring that these actions are successful, and it's about ultimately trying to take everybody along with us in the steps that we take. So we have a fisheries management and conservation group who've been really instrumental in working with us in developing our policies. We also have in our inshore fisheries similar groups that we work alongside. And that shared stewardship approach of our marine environment is really what underpins our vision for a blue economy in Scotland. We know we have a lot going on in our marine space at the moment, but I think it's only by working with people, by taking them alongside us, that involves the communities who depend on these different industries as well. That's what's really critical in implementing these actions and ensuring that they are a success. I
just wanted to read you, thank you, a couple of questions that have come through on Slido, which are, I think, they are questions, but they are questions that sort of play to the gap. You know, one Vera Coelho says, how do we move from international commitments and negotiations towards the urgent actions that are needed to tackle the climate and nature crises? I'm not going to ask you to answer that because you've sort of been answering it, but we've had several questions along that line. That gives you, I think, a sense of the urgency that people in the audience have about moving to actually making things happen. Olivia, I want to turn to a different subject for you now, which is deep sea mining. 2023 is a pivotal year for deep sea mining. I think there's a UN deadline in July to agree on regulations at the International Seabed Authority. The French government, Parliament recently voted in favor of banning deep sea mining in its waters. Can you give us an update of where we are on this? What would the French government like to see happen next?
You know, it's a major issue because in 2 weeks' time in Kingston, Jamaica, at the ISA, the International Seabed Authorities, there will be the start of a new negotiation of the Deep Sea Mining Code. And Mr. Macron, my president, made a statement in Lisbon last year, and then again at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was expressing an extreme position, which is for us the ban of any deep sea mining, because it's not the time to do that. The ocean is in such bad health, bad conditions that upon this, you know, this issue is really, I would say, criminal. We don't know about the ocean. We don't know about deep sea mining. We don't know about the effect of what it will affect, how it will affect the environment. So, so we are currently holding a very strong stance for the defense of what we call either a ban of deep sea mining, or if it's too extreme for some countries, we can call it a moratorium or precautionary pause when it comes to deep sea mining, as well as a strong stance, in the same time on the necessity of increasing ocean science. So we will meet again with some like-minded countries like Germany, Chile, Costa Rica. We are more and more, something like 20 countries which are in favor of this precautionary pause during the discussion about the deep sea mining code. We will meet in, I think, that the day after tomorrow, I'll be in Panama with our Secretary of State for the Sea, and we will try to have a number of countries we can, postpone this agreement on deep sea mining. We can wait 10 years, 20 years. We don't need that, in fact, even on an economical perspective.
Thank you. Well, that's it's a clear position from France, a precautionary pause. Myri, let me turn to you because Scotland is home to, thriving aquaculture, offshore wind, fishing, coastal tourism, but the seabed is also becoming a busier place. How do you think about this? What do you think about the idea of precautionary pause in deep sea mining? How do you think about creating a balance between the different kinds of uses of the ocean?
Well, that is exactly what we're trying to strike. But I mean, there's no question that all of this is really difficult and really hard to manage. We're at a time when we're more focused on our energy security, and quite rightly, we're going to see an expansion in offshore renewables in Scotland. We're also quite rightly focused on our food security too, which I think has been brought into sharp focus because of events over the course of the past year. So we have that, but we also need to protect our marine environment. In Scotland, we have specific commitments that we want to reach. We have 37% of our seas are covered with marine protected areas. We want to introduce highly protected marine areas to cover 10% of our inshore and offshore waters too. So that then means that there is a squeeze in terms of our marine space. In relation to the HPMA work, we're still in the very initial stages. We're really trying to work with people in terms of determining how we select those sites and what that might look like. But we are still manoeuvring through these questions, because if we displace activities, that could then put more pressure, whether that's in relation to fisheries in other parts of the sea. So it is about how we ultimately try and get that balance and ensure that we are doing what we can in relation to that. And I think that's where our national marine plan and how we take that forward is going to be really critical.
Angela, the WTO thinks about global trade rules broadly. What does the idea of precautionary pause, how does the WTO think about that?
Well, when you say the WTO...
how do you think about that? Never mind the WTO.
Yes, we're made up of our members, so we're not a monolith. I think that different members look at this in different ways, depending on their perspectives. And that's our challenge in the WTO, to try to figure out what our next steps are with respect to things like precautionary pause, things like plastics, things like fish, things like carbon pricing. And I think that it creates an opportunity, because at the WTO, everyone's at the table, 164 members. So it's really a chance to fight these issues out. Maybe fight is the wrong word.
Maybe have constructive discussion is what you mean.
To have constructive discussions, but it's hard and it gets bitter. There's just so much at stake. And of course, having to address, as we absolutely need to, the question of developing countries and development, and creating, as they would argue, policy space to have that opportunity for industrialization, regardless of what the particular issue is. So those are the challenges that we have. And we just have to create a forum where everyone is free to be able to address those particular issues. This is no longer a club of just a few countries, like multilateralism was back in the old days. And now it is much more inclusive. We have to be more inclusive as well of civil society, of stakeholders of all types, because these questions that we're talking about, yes, they're government questions, but they also have to do with the private sector, with civil society, and they all have to have some ability to participate in this discussion.
Absolutely. And in fact, talking about the ability to participate, although I have a bajillion other questions, I want to make sure that those of you in the room have the ability to participate. So are there any questions that anyone has right now in the room? You might just have to stand up because the lights are very low. Is there any? Yes, gentleman there standing up.
Hey, how's it? Jeremy McCain, OCN.ai. On this issue of deep sea mining, I mean, clearly these are conflict minerals. Never mind the fact that it's not a good investment. Some numbers state that over a $7 billion investment, you would get $0 in EBITDA. But we just don't have the data right now. So, I mean, I think we need to take a stronger stance on this. And I would love to hear from you. I think it's Angelo, correct? What else can we do right now to kind of stop, essentially, what could be a greater threat than climate change?
Thank you. Should we go to Olivia first and then to you, Angela? Because Olivia, France is taking a stand on this. What more could you do?
Well, what we can do is to be in Jamaica in 2 weeks' time and to say no during this first assembly of the council. There will be 3 meetings, one in March, the other one in July, and the last one in November. So France say no, and we are more and more with Germany, and as I told you, we are around, let's say, 20 countries. And I should say, you know, we are, us French, we are the second largest economic zone in the world. So we apply this ban of deep sea mining on our own territory. So it's not making speech or virtuous speech. It's really to be very concrete. And so if we can have the data in, let's say, in 20 years or in 10 years, even 5 years, if we can know exactly what will be the effect of deep sea mining on the environment, we can sign this deep sea mining code. But please wait. And I'm sure, and we are discussing that in Panama and then Kingston, you will see, normally, if everything is okay, the deep sea mining code will be postponed in the next year, and everybody will get better.
Angela, would you like to add anything to that?
I think the premise of the question is very interesting, just in terms of data. And I think there are lessons here, not just with respect to deep sea mining, but more broadly. The importance in this type of negotiation of having the right data, having data that members can agree on as being the basis for making decisions. And that's all based on transparency and creating an atmosphere of negotiation in which there really is this type of transparency. That's very hard. I know that in our fish negotiations, just by way of an example, that's been one of the hardest challenges, is to get more information on subsidies, the subsidies that are actually provided with respect to IUU fishing, let's say. So that's one of the elements that we included in our agreement, is to get data, to require our members to notify the types of subsidies, and also to notify about the others that are around them.
So you would want the same thing around deep sea mining and other such issues, more data, more transparency.
I think it's the only way.
Absolutely, and I think that's something everyone can agree on, and it's certainly something that we will be focusing a lot on in the next couple of days, because that brings rigor to any conversation, and it makes trade-offs much more obvious to see, and more data, more and better data is crucial. I want to end by asking each of you, because we are already running out of time, sadly. There is a terrific question here, which I want you just to give a 20-second answer to, and you will laugh out loud when you hear this, but nonetheless, it's a wonderful question. The time scales for the changes needed and the time policymakers take to agree these seem oceans apart. What opportunity do you see to achieve real progress now? What single thing, just point to one thing that you would want the audience to remember as an opportunity for real progress in the coming months? And Olivier, let's start with you.
We have to do what was done in 2015 for the climate with the Paris Agreement. We have to find an agreement. Is that a 1.5 degree or something like that? But 30 by 30 by the end of 2030 is a good example of what the international community is able to do. So if there is one point, is protecting the biodiversity and having more marine protected areas all over the world, especially in the high seas, if the high seas treaty is agreed on Friday evening in New York.
So make that happen 30 by 30. Excellent. Thank you. Mary?
I would absolutely agree with Olivier's point. I think we're certainly in Scotland on our track there. We need to make sure that we're putting these commitments into action and we're not waiting to take action. But critical to me throughout all of that as well is how we ensure a just transition. These are difficult changes we're talking about, so it's making sure that that's done in as fair a way and taking our communities with us.
That is an immensely important subject, which we should have devoted some time to, but we will in the rest of the conference. Angela, last word is yours.
Well, I agree with all of these points, so I won't repeat them, and I'll point to something else instead, which is we need to see entry into force of the fish agreement. We need 2/3 of our members to stand up and say, here are our instruments, this now goes into effect. We are looking out for developing countries to help them be able to take that step because it's a huge one for them, understandably. And then finally, we have to finish our second wave of negotiations. Our ministers, our trade ministers have given themselves a deadline of next February, and we're going to do everything possible to make sure they meet that.
Great, thank you. You've held yourselves to some high standards. Angela Ellard, Mary Goujon, Olivier Poivre, thank you all for joining us for an introductory panel. We're now going to make sure that we spend the rest of the next 2 days putting some flesh on all of that. Thank you very much, and I'm now going to bring on Charlie Goddard, somewhere, my colleague, for the second panel. Thank you.